It is the 25th of May, 1928, and an airship is coming down over the Arctic Ocean. She is heavy with ice. She has been sinking for an hour. At 33 minutes past 10 in the morning, the control cabin strikes the pack ice and is torn clean off the ship, and 10 men go out onto the ice with it. Above them, suddenly a ton lighter, the rest of the airship lifts and drifts away east, with 6 men still aboard. 9 of the men on the ice are alive. One of them designed this airship. He is the commander of the expedition. His right leg and his right arm are broken, and in 4 weeks a plane will land beside him and take him off first. It will save his life. It will destroy everything else about it. His name is Umberto Nobile. He is an engineer, and he builds airships. 2 years earlier, he had flown one over the North Pole. That flight was called the Norge, and the man who led it was Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian who had reached the South Pole first and sailed the Northwest Passage. Nobile designed the airship and flew it. Amundsen thought of him as a hired pilot. Nobile thought of himself as a partner. When they came back, Italy made Nobile a general and put him on the front of every newspaper in the country, and Amundsen never forgave him for it. He attacked Nobile in print, personally, at length. Their quarrel was public property for 2 years. Mussolini's Italy wanted a polar triumph of its own, with no Norwegians in it, so Nobile built a second airship. He called her the Italia. On the 23rd of May, 1928, the Italia lifted off from Svalbard and turned north. 16 men were aboard. Shortly after midnight, they reached the North Pole, after about 20 hours in the air, and they came down low and circled it for 2 hours. They dropped an Italian flag. They dropped the flag of the city of Milan. They dropped a heavy oak cross that the Pope had given them to leave at the top of the world. And then they did something that saved 9 lives, by failing to do it. The plan had been to land, to put men down on the ice at the pole and leave them there to work. The wind was too strong, and Nobile called it off, but the equipment for that landing was already aboard. A tent, sledge rations, a small emergency radio. Remember that tent. They turned for home into a headwind and spent the next 30 hours barely moving. The ice built up on her skin and in her rigging, and she got heavier, and she flew lower. At 25 past 9 on the morning of the 25th, the Italia began to sink on her own, not a dive. A slow, steady, uncommanded descent, about 2 feet every second, with the tail hanging low. The elevator control had jammed. Nobile ordered the engines to full and the ballast released. The ship steadied. Then she started down again, faster, and this time she did not stop. The cabin hit the ice at 10:33 and was ripped off the keel, taking part of the ship's frame and the rear engine with it. The rear engine mechanic was killed instantly. He was 33 years old, and he was the only man who died in the crash. Everyone else in that cabin was suddenly sitting on the ice in the wreckage, watching the rest of their airship rise. In the seconds before it went, the chief mechanic, still up in the keel, still moving, already lost, threw supplies down onto the ice to the men below him. Food, mostly. That is the only reason there was anything to eat. The envelope drifted east with 6 men aboard and went over the horizon. Nothing of it has ever been found. Not the airship, not the 6 men, not one item they carried, and no cause for the crash was ever established. It is still not settled. 9 men then on moving sea ice. 2 of them could not walk, Nobile, with his broken leg and arm, and the chief technician, whose leg was broken badly. The other 7 were more or less intact. They had a tent designed to sleep about 4. 9 men lived in it. They had pemmican and chocolate and a little sugar, which on strict rations came to perhaps 45 days if nobody cheated. And here is where the tent gets its name. It was not a red tent, it was ordinary canvas. But the expedition had been carrying glass vials of dye, meant to be dropped onto the ice, so the crew could measure their drift and their height from the air. The survivors broke those vials over the canvas and drew red lines out across the ice around it, so that if anybody ever came looking, there would be something to see against all that white. They also had a radio. It had come through the crash undamaged, and it belonged to a Navy telegraphist called Giuseppe Biaggi. Biaggi was not hurt. He rigged an aerial out of wreckage, and he began sending. The set put out 5 watts. 5, about what a nightlight burns. He sent at fixed times, every few hours, for 9 days, and nobody answered. What made it unbearable was that he could hear. The receiver worked. So the 9 men sat in a dyed tent on a drifting floe and listened to Italian radio bulletins describing the search for the missing airship Italia, and then describing how hope was fading, and then describing rather less about it each day. They could hear the world giving up on them, and they could not make the world hear one word back. There were 3 reasons, and only one of them was anybody's fault. The transmitter was tiny, and the aerial was improvised. That was one. The second is that a study published in 2020 reconstructed the space weather over those weeks and found the upper atmosphere genuinely disturbed, which would have wrecked long-range shortwave at those latitudes. There was a physical reason nobody heard them. And the third is that the expedition's own base ship, sitting off Svalbard, was not really listening. Her radio room was busy. It was passing press traffic for the journalists. Guglielmo Marconi said afterwards, more or less plainly, that the operators had not been paying attention. By the end of May, the food was going down, and the ice was drifting the wrong way, and one of the 9 argued that somebody had to walk. Finn Malmgren was a Swedish meteorologist and the only man in the camp with real polar experience. He had one arm half-wrecked in the crash. He said a small party should go over the pack towards land and bring back help. Nobile did not want to split the group. He was argued out of it. On the 30th of May, Malmgren and 2 Italian naval officers walked out of camp and away south, and the men at the tent watched them until they could not see them anymore. They did not know what the ice was doing. The floe was drifting northeast, faster than 3 injured men could walk southwest. 4 days later, on the 3rd of June, a young man in a village in northern Russia, about 2,000 kilometers away, was listening on a receiver he had built himself. He picked up fragments, Italia, Nobile, SOS. He reported it. Moscow told Rome, and on the 8th of June, the base ship finally answered Biagi and asked him where he was. A farm worker with a homemade radio heard them before their own ship did. After that, it became the largest polar rescue anybody had ever mounted. 6 countries, something like 18 ships and 20 aircraft, and about 1,500 men converging on a piece of ice that would not stay still. On the 18th of June, Roald Amundsen took off from Tromsø in a French flying boat to join the search. This is the man who had spent 2 years attacking Nobile in public. He did not have to go, he went. He was heard on the radio at 6:45 that evening, trying to raise Kings Bay, then nothing. No wreck was found, and no bodies were recovered. At the end of August, a fishing boat picked up one of the aircraft's floats off the Norwegian coast. It had been torn off, and somebody had lashed it and worked on it, as though they had been trying to turn it into a boat. Roald Amundsen went looking for a man he had publicly despised, and was never seen again. On the 20th of June, an Italian flying boat came over the camp and saw the red tent. 26 days after the crash, somebody had finally seen them. The pilot could not land. He dropped supplies and flew away. Then they waited 3 more days, having been found. Just before midnight on the 23rd of June, a Swedish pilot put a small ski plane down on the ice beside the tent. Nobile had already written out the order in which the camp was to be evacuated. The worst injured first. That meant the technician with the broken leg, not him. The pilot refused. He said his orders were to take Nobile, and Nobile only, on this flight. Nobile objected. Then he got in the aircraft. And he took the dog. Her name was Titina. She was a fox terrier, and she had been on the ice with the men for a month. Putting her in that plane was not a crime, and it was not even unreasonable. But it produced a photograph and a sentence that no explanation has ever been able to catch. The general came off the ice first, with his lapdog, and left an injured mechanic behind him. The pilot flew back the next day for the technician, nosed the plane over on landing, and wrecked it. He was unhurt. He was also, now, the 10th man in the camp. He was there for nearly 2 weeks. On the 6th of July, a Swedish colleague landed a light aircraft on the floe. It could carry 1 passenger. It took the Swedish pilot, and it left. The Italians watched a rescue plane arrive, collect the rescuer, and go. What finally reached them was a Soviet icebreaker called the Krasin, which had sailed from Leningrad on the 16th of June and spent 3 weeks smashing north through heavy ice, damaging her propeller and her rudder doing it. On the 10th of July, her reconnaissance pilot spotted 2 men on the ice. Fog and low fuel forced him down onto the pack, and he and his crew were stranded there themselves. He radioed the ship and told her to leave him where he was and go to the Italians first. She did. On the 12th of July, the Krasin took 2 men off the ice. They were the walkers. There were only 2 of them. One of them was close to death, starved, snowblind, his feet gangrenous. He would lose a leg. The other was in visibly better condition, and he was wearing several layers of clothing, including a coat and gloves that had belonged to Finn Malmgren. Malmgren had died somewhere in the middle of June. Both men said the same thing, that he could not go on, that he asked them to leave him, and that he refused to take any of the remaining food. Their accounts of the days did not perfectly agree. His body was never recovered. There is no forensic evidence of any kind, and there never can be. Within weeks, the newspapers of 3 countries were asking whether the 2 survivors had eaten him. That is what the accusation rested on, entirely. One man looked better fed than the other, and he was wearing the dead man's coat. An Italian commission examined it and cleared them both. They denied it, consistently, for the rest of their lives. One of them married the following year. He named his son Finn. Later on the same day, the 12th of July, the Krasin reached the red tent and lifted off the last 5 men, 48 days after the crash. 17 people died because of the Italia, 6 went with the envelope, 1 died in the crash, Malmgren died on the ice, the rest were rescuers, including Amundsen and the 5 men who flew with him. More people died looking for the survivors than died in the accident. Nobile came home to crowds. The crowds cheered, the government did not. There was no decoration, no command, and within weeks the Italian press had turned on him with what looked very much like official encouragement. A commission of inquiry, chaired by an admiral, reported in March 1929. It found against Nobile personally errors of navigation, errors of ballast, his handling of the descent, and it censured him, explicitly, for having accepted evacuation on the first aircraft. It cleared the 2 walkers of everything. It did not examine the radio room of the base ship. He resigned his commission. Some say he was pushed. A regime built on the image of the unbreakable commander needed the disaster to belong to one man rather than to itself, and he was a convenient man to give it to. In 1932, he went to the Soviet Union and spent 5 years there designing and building airships for the state, for the country whose icebreaker had taken his men off the ice. Then he taught aeronautics in Chicago for 3 years. In 1945, with fascism gone, the Italian Air Force cleared him of every charge and restored his rank. In 1946, he was elected to the assembly that wrote the Constitution of the Italian Republic. He went on publishing about airships into his 80s, and he argued about that flight for the rest of his life. Umberto Nobile died in Rome on the 30th of July, 1978, 50 years after the crash.